I grew up hearing the stories of Sasquatch Ridge, a remote part of the Pacific Northwest wilderness where the dense forests and towering mountains created a natural barrier against the world. Locals often shared tales of a creature that roamed the area, a giant covered in dark fur, with eyes that glowed like embers in the night. They called it Bigfoot. To most, it was just a legend, a way to scare children into staying out of the woods. But for me, it became more than that. It all started when my best friend, Caleb, convinced me to go on a weekend camping trip to Sasquatch Ridge. He was an outdoorsman at heart, always looking for the next adventure, and the stories of Bigfoot had fascinated him since childhood. I, on the other hand, was more skeptical. While I enjoyed the occasional hike, the idea of spending a weekend in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife, wasn't exactly my idea of fun. But Caleb had a way of getting people to say yes, so I reluctantly agreed. We packed our gear, loaded up Caleb's truck, and made our way to the ridge. The drive took hours, the paved roads gradually giving way to dirt paths that wound deeper into the forest. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled my lungs as we stepped out of the truck and surveyed the area. "Perfect," Caleb said with a grin, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "This is going to be epic." I wasn't so sure. Something about the place felt off. It was too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But I didn't want to be the one to spoil the mood, so I kept my concerns to myself and followed Caleb up the trail. We hiked for about an hour, the path gradually becoming steeper as we climbed higher into the mountains. The trees were thick here, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out most of the fading light. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Eventually, we reached a clearing near the top of the ridge, where Caleb decided we should set up camp. The view was breathtaking, the forest stretching out below us like a sea of green, with the distant peaks of the Cascades rising against the horizon. Caleb was already setting up the tent, whistling to himself as he worked, while I gathered firewood from the edge of the clearing. As the night settled in, the temperature dropped, and we huddled around the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Caleb pulled out a flask from his pack, taking a swig before passing it to me. "To Bigfoot," he said with a wink. I rolled my eyes but took a drink anyway. The warmth of the whiskey spread through my chest, momentarily easing the knot of tension that had been building since we arrived. For the first time since we'd set out, I started to relax, but that peace didn't last long. It was some time after midnight when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the darkness just beyond the edge of the firelight. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound had already faded, swallowed by the night. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my eyes darting toward Caleb. He looked up from his sleeping bag, frowning. "Hear what?" I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but the forest remained silent. "Never mind," I muttered, shaking my head. "It's probably just my imagination," Caleb chuckled, rolling over to face me. "You're starting to believe the stories, aren't you?" "No," I said quickly, though even I didn't believe my own words. "I'm just tired." But as I lay there, staring up at the stars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was out there, watching us. I could feel it. The next morning, I woke to find Caleb already up, cooking breakfast over the fire. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the scent of impending rain. "Sleep well?" he asked, handing me a cup of coffee. "Not really," I admitted, taking a sip. "I kept hearing things. Probably just the wind," he said, though I could tell by the look on his face that he wasn't entirely convinced. We spent the day exploring the ridge, following game trails that wound through the forest, looking for signs of wildlife. But as the hours passed, my unease only grew. There were no birds, no squirrels, no deer, nothing. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if all the animals had fled, leaving the woods deserted. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Caleb suggested we head back to camp before the storm hit, and I didn't argue. As we retraced our steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a flash of dark fur, the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. We reached the clearing just as the rain began to pour, the wind howling through the trees. We quickly gathered what firewood we could find and retreated into the tent, the sound of the storm drowning out all other noise. Caleb seemed unfazed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. It wasn't until the middle of the night that my fears were confirmed. I woke to the sound of the tent zipper being slowly pulled open. For a moment, I thought it was Caleb, but when I turned to look, I saw him still lying beside me, fast asleep. I froze, my heart racing as I watched the zipper continue to move, inching its way down. A gust of cold air blew into the tent, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of wet fur and decay. And then I saw it, a massive, shadowy figure standing just outside the tent, its glowing eyes locked on mine. It was Bigfoot. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat as the creature stepped forward, its massive hand reaching for the tent flap. In that moment, I knew we were going to die. There was no way we could outrun it, no way we could fight it off. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. It sniffed the air, its eyes narrowing as if it had detected something. And then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When Caleb finally woke, I told him what I'd seen, but he just laughed it off, calling it a nightmare brought on by too much whiskey and too little sleep. But I knew what I saw. We left the ridge the next morning, and I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, but I'm certain of one thing: Bigfoot is real, and it's watching. My name is Jason, and I've spent most of my life as a skeptic. I was never one to believe in the supernatural, cryptids, or any of the local legends that people around my small town like to tell. I laughed off ghost stories, ridiculed anyone who talked about UFOs, and rolled my eyes at the mention of Bigfoot. That is, until the events of one particular trip changed everything. It was early spring, just before the season when the tourists and hikers start flocking to the Cascade Mountains. My friends and I, Troy, Megan, and Danny, had planned a camping trip to Sasquatch Lake, a remote body of water nestled deep in the mountains. The lake got its name from the local legend that claimed it was a hotspot for Bigfoot sightings. According to the story, several hunters had disappeared near the lake in the late 1970s, their bodies never found, but huge footprints were discovered along the shoreline. I dismissed the tale as nothing more than a campfire story designed to keep the curious from venturing too deep into the woods. Troy was the one who pushed for the trip. He'd recently bought new camping gear and wanted to test it out, and Megan and Danny were eager to join. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of spending a weekend in the middle of nowhere, especially in a place named after a mythical creature. But peer pressure and a desire to escape the monotony of daily life eventually convinced me. We loaded up Troy's truck with our gear, packed enough food and supplies for the weekend, and set off early on a Friday morning. The drive took us through winding mountain roads, the dense forest on either side of us making it feel like we were driving into another world. By the time we reached the gravel road that led to Sasquatch Lake, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. As we pulled up to the trailhead, an eerie sense of isolation washed over me. There was no sign of any other campers, no parked cars, and no distant voices echoing through the woods. We were completely alone. The lake itself was about a 2-mile hike from the trailhead, and we figured we could reach it in an hour if we kept a steady pace. Megan, ever the optimist, was excited. "This is going to be amazing," she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Just the four of us, no cell service, no distractions. We're really going to connect with nature out here." I wasn't so sure, but I kept my doubts to myself. Troy led the way, carrying most of the gear, while Megan and Danny chatted and laughed behind him. I brought up the rear, feeling a growing sense of unease as we ventured deeper into the woods. The hike was beautiful but unsettling. The trees were tall and ancient, their thick trunks blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was cool, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustling of branches in the wind, and the distant calls of birds I couldn't identify. Occasionally, I thought I heard something else, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from deeper in the forest, but every time I stopped to listen, it would disappear. After what felt like forever, we reached the lake. It was breathtaking, a crystal, clear body of water surrounded by towering pine trees, with the mountains rising in the distance. But despite its beauty, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We set up camp near the shore, pitching our tents and gathering firewood. Troy was in his element, chopping wood and getting the fire going, while Megan and Danny unpacked the food and set up a makeshift kitchen. I wandered down to the edge of the lake, staring out at the water. The surface was calm, reflecting the darkening sky above, but something about it felt wrong, too still, too quiet. "Hey, Jason," Danny called from behind me, breaking my trance. "We're going to take a swim before it gets dark. You in?" I shook my head. "I'll pass. I'm not really in the mood." Danny shrugged and ran toward the water, splashing in alongside Troy and Megan. Their laughter echoed across the lake, but it did little to ease my growing sense of dread. As the sun began to set, I decided to gather more firewood from the surrounding forest. I told myself it was just to keep busy, but in truth, I needed an excuse to get away from the lake. The further I walked into the trees, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt heavier, and the forest grew darker with each step. I kept hearing that same rhythmic thumping, like something was moving through the woods, just out of sight. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find the source. It wasn't long before I felt completely lost. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees all looking the same. Panic began to set in, and I quickened my pace, trying to find my way back to camp. That's when I saw it, a large, shadowy figure moving between the trees, its massive form blending into the darkness. My heart raced, and I froze in place, staring at the spot where the figure had been. For a moment, everything was still, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I stumbled back to camp, my mind racing. When I arrived, the fire was blazing, and my friends were sitting around it, laughing and talking as if nothing was wrong. "Jason, you okay?" Megan asked, noticing the look on my face. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "Yeah, just thought I saw something in the woods. Probably just a deer," Troy said with a grin, handing me a beer. "Relax, man. We're here to have fun." I forced a smile and sat down by the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. That night, as we settled into our tents, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustled the trees, and every now and then, I thought I heard that same thumping sound, like heavy footsteps moving through the woods. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again, the sound of something moving outside the tent. It was slow, deliberate, like whatever it was didn't want to be noticed. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then, just as I was about to write it off as the wind, I heard a low growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the side of the tent. My heart pounded in my chest, and I scrambled to grab my flashlight. I fumbled with the switch, my hands shaking, and when the beam of light finally cut through the darkness, I saw it, a massive, shadowy figure standing just outside the tent. Its eyes glowed in the light, reflecting back at me like two burning coals. I froze, too terrified to move. The figure stared at me for what felt like an eternity before it slowly turned and disappeared into the trees. I lay there shaking until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out of the tent, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. I found Troy, Megan, and Danny still asleep, oblivious to what had happened. I didn't say anything about what I'd seen. I wasn't sure they'd believe me, and even if they did, what could we do? We were miles from civilization, with no way to call for help. We packed up camp later that morning, and as we hiked back to the truck, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature following us. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of trees and the distant sound of the wind. We never spoke about that trip again. But every now and then, late at night, I think about Sasquatch Lake, and I wonder if the stories are true. Because whatever I saw out there, it wasn't human, and it's still out there, waiting. I wasn't the type to go camping. In fact, I preferred the hum of the city over the rustling of leaves any day. But when my old friend Carl called me up, talking about a weekend getaway deep in the forests of Oregon, I reluctantly agreed. Carl had always been the adventurous type, dragging me along for hikes, canoeing, and rock climbing trips. We hadn't seen each other in a couple of years, so I figured a little break from my desk job wouldn't hurt. Carl, his girlfriend Lucy, and I packed up his old Jeep with tents, food, and supplies before heading into the deep woods. The drive was long, taking us through winding roads, past sprawling meadows, and into the towering pines of the Pacific Northwest. After what felt like hours, we reached our destination, a secluded campsite surrounded by dense trees and thick underbrush. "This is it," Carl said, grinning as he parked the Jeep and jumped out. I wasn't quite as enthusiastic. The place was remote, miles away from any form of civilization. No cell service, no power, just us and the wilderness. It was a beautiful place, don't get me wrong, pristine, and touched by human hands. But there was something about the silence that unnerved me. As we set up our tents, Lucy hummed to herself, clearly excited about the weekend. I tried to shake off my nerves and get into the spirit of things. After all, I was here to relax, not stress about being out of my element. By the time we had everything set up, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the campsite. The temperature dropped quickly, and Carl lit a campfire to keep us warm. We sat around it, toasting marshmallows and telling stories as the night settled in. Carl was always the storyteller, and he had a way of spinning a tale that made you hang on his every word. That night, he told us about the legend of the Rogue River werewolf, a story that had been passed down by the local tribes for generations. They say this creature roams these very woods, Carl began, his voice low and dramatic. A massive wolf-like beast, standing on two legs, with glowing red eyes and a howl that can chill your bones. It's been seen by hikers, campers, even hunters. Some say it's a man cursed to roam the earth forever, doomed to transform under the full moon. Lucy shivered beside him, though I could tell she was enjoying the tale. I wasn't so sure. Carl had always loved his horror stories, but something about this one felt too real. "You're full of it," I said, trying to laugh it off. Carl grinned, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "You'll see. Maybe tonight, we'll hear the howl of the Rogue River werewolf ourselves." I rolled my eyes and tossed another log onto the fire, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach didn't go away. As the night wore on, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees. The fire crackled and popped, casting eerie shadows around the campsite. Lucy yawned, stretching her arms above her head. "I'm calling it a night," she said, standing up and brushing dirt off her jeans. Carl nodded and stood up too. "Yeah, we should get some rest. Big hike tomorrow." I wasn't about to argue. The idea of retreating to the safety of my tent sounded pretty good. We put out the fire and said our goodnights before retreating to our tents. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was so quiet, so still, that every little rustle of leaves or creak of branches seemed amplified. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard it, the faintest sound of something moving just outside the tent. At first, I thought it was Carl or Lucy, maybe walking around to check on something. But then I heard it again, a low growl, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. My heart raced, and I lay there, frozen in place. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, maybe, but the growl was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was deep, guttural, almost human in a way that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to sit up, straining to listen. The footsteps were getting closer now, heavy and deliberate. Whatever it was big. I reached for the flashlight by my side, fumbling with it in the darkness. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, like something large had slammed into Carl's tent. I heard him shout in surprise, followed by Lucy's terrified scream. My hands shook as I flicked on the flashlight and unzipped my tent, scrambling out into the cold night air. Carl and Lucy were already outside, their faces pale in the moonlight. Carl was holding a hatchet in one hand, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see it?" he gasped, his voice trembling. I shook my head, shining the flashlight around the campsite. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But I could feel it. Something was out there, watching us. "We need to leave," Lucy whispered, clutching Carl's arm. "Now." Carl hesitated, his grip tightening on the hatchet. "I don't know. Maybe it was just a bear." "That wasn't a bear," I snapped. "We need to get out of here." Carl looked torn, but another growl, louder this time, made the decision for him. He nodded, and we quickly gathered our things, throwing them into the back of the jeep as fast as we could. The whole time, I felt like we were being watched, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting for us to make a mistake. As we piled into the jeep and Carl started the engine, I glanced out the window, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it. A massive figure stood at the edge of the forest, illuminated by the jeep's headlights. It was at least 8 feet tall, with thick, matted fur and glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Its mouth was open in a snarl, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. It was standing on 2 legs, its massive arms hanging at its sides. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The creature stared at us, and blinking, as if daring us to move. Then Carl hit the gas, and we tore down the dirt road, the creature disappearing into the shadows behind us. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, none of us daring to speak. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It couldn't have been real. Creatures like that didn't exist. But the memory of those glowing eyes and the way it moved, it was burned into my mind. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from the campsite. Back on the main road, Carl finally pulled over at a gas station, his hands still shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. "What the hell was that?" Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. We sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, we drove back to the city, abandoning our plans for the weekend. None of us ever talked about that night again. It was as if we'd all silently agreed to forget about it, to pretend it never happened. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I think about that creature. I think about the way it looked at us, the way it moved. And I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for its next victims. I've never been camping since. I've never been able to shake the feeling that no matter where I am, something is always watching, always waiting in the shadows. And every now and then, I swear I can hear it, the low, haunting howl of the Rogue River werewolf. I had always loved the peace and solitude of the mountains. Growing up in the bustling city, I had dreamt of owning a small, secluded cabin far away from the noise. So when the opportunity arose to purchase a piece of land in the Appalachian Mountains with an old, abandoned cabin on it, I jumped at the chance. I didn't care about the cabin's condition. I was ready for a project and a quiet escape. The land was stunning, towering trees, crystal, clear streams, and rugged trails that seemed to stretch forever. The cabin itself, however, was another story. It looked as though it had been forgotten for decades. The roof sagged in places, the windows were cracked, and the wood was weathered and covered in moss. But it had character, and I was determined to restore it to its former glory. I spent weeks cleaning it up, repairing the roof, replacing the windows, and making it livable again. As I worked, I couldn't help but feel an odd sensation that I wasn't alone. At first, I chalked it up to the isolation. I wasn't used to being so far away from people. But the feeling persisted, like a pair of eyes were always watching me from the shadows of the surrounding forest. It wasn't just the sensation of being watched. Strange things started happening. Tools I had left neatly arranged would disappear, only to turn up in odd places. The cabin door, which I had locked before heading into town for supplies, would sometimes be open when I returned. I assumed it was my own forgetfulness, but it started to gnaw at me. One evening, as I was finishing up some repairs on the front porch, I noticed something out of place. Just beyond the tree line, there was a figure, tall, shadowy, and still. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but as I squinted into the twilight, I realized it was too tall, too human, like to be anything but a person. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky but loud enough to carry. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. My heart began to race, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I reached for my flashlight and shone it toward the figure, but the beam cut through empty air. The figure was gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or my imagination playing tricks on me after weeks of isolation. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, checking them before retreating to the safety of my bed. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke to find the front door wide open. I distinctly remembered locking it the night before. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached the door, peeking out into the empty yard. There was no sign of anyone or anything. I decided it was time to do a little research. After driving into the nearest town, I headed to the local library, hoping to dig up some history on the land and the cabin. Maybe there was an explanation for the strange occurrences, something to put my mind at ease. The librarian, a friendly woman named Martha, seemed eager to help when I mentioned the cabin's location. "You bought that old place up on Hilltop Ridge?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not many folks around here would go near it. Why's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my pulse quickened. "Well," she leaned in a little closer, lowering her voice. "There's been talk for years about that place. People say it's haunted, or cursed even. The last family that lived there, well, they didn't leave under the best circumstances." "What happened?" I pressed. "They vanished," Martha said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The whole family, mother, father, 2 kids. No one ever found a trace of them. Some folks say they just up and left, but others think something darker happened." My stomach tightened. "Darker like what?" "There were rumors," she continued, glancing around as if someone might overhear, "about strange rituals, maybe even sacrifices. But nothing was ever proven. The family was just gone." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Has anyone lived there since?" Martha shook her head. "No one has stayed there for long. People who've tried to fix up the place always leave, saying the same thing. You're never truly alone up there." Her words hung in the air as I left the library, a growing sense of dread building inside me. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but there was no denying that something was off about the cabin. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to stay one more night, but this time I would be prepared. I bought extra locks, reinforced the doors, and even set up a motion sensor light outside. If someone or something was messing with me, I was going to catch them. The night fell quickly, the sky turning a deep, inky black. I sat in the cabin, every muscle tense, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, but otherwise, everything was still. until I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, more insistent. The sound was coming from the back of the cabin. My pulse quickened, and I grabbed the flashlight, slowly making my way toward the back door. The tapping stopped abruptly as I reached the door. I hesitated for a moment, hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally turning it and yanking the door open. Nothing. The yard was empty, the trees swaying in the wind, but no one was there. I let out a shaky breath and stepped outside, shining the flashlight around the perimeter. The beam of light caught something, a movement, or flash of something darting between the trees. My heart raced as I followed it, the light flickering as I moved deeper into the woods. Then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the forest, just out of reach of the light, was the figure again. Tall, dark, and impossibly still. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Fear surged through me, and I turned, sprinting back toward the cabin. My footsteps pounded against the ground, the darkness closing in around me. When I finally reached the porch, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my chest heaving with panic. I collapsed onto the floor, trying to catch my breath, when suddenly the lights went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Then the tapping started again, louder this time, more frantic. It was coming from the walls, the windows, all around me. I fumbled for my flashlight, turning it on just as something slammed against the front door. The door shook violently, the sound of wood splintering as whatever was outside tried to force its way in. My mind raced. Should I run, hide, fight? I backed away from the door, heart pounding, when suddenly the tapping stopped. Silence filled the cabin, thick and oppressive. Then a voice, soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Leave." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was coming from inside the cabin. Slowly, I turned, shining the flashlight into the room behind me. There, standing in the shadows, was the figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Before I could react, the figure lunged toward me. I screamed, throwing myself to the floor as the figure passed through me like smoke. The air was cold, so cold that I could see my breath hanging in front of me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the cabin, not stopping until I was in the jeep, driving as fast as I could down the winding mountain road. I never went back to the cabin. I sold the land, barely breaking even, and tried to put the whole experience behind me. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the tapping again, faint but unmistakable. And I know deep down that whatever was in that cabin, it's still with me. My name is Henry Graves, and I work as a night security guard at a gated community in upstate New York. It's a pretty standard gig, patrolling the streets in my golf cart, checking on the empty houses for sale, and making sure nothing goes wrong in the dead of night. The neighborhood itself is quiet, full of wealthy residents who rarely venture out after dark. The worst things I've had to deal with so far have been teenagers sneaking in to use the pool or stray animals knocking over trash cans. It wasn't a bad job. It wasn't exciting either, but it paid the bills and kept me out of the chaos of the city. Most nights were uneventful. I'd spend my shifts watching movies on my phone, drinking coffee to stay awake, and waiting for the clock to hit 6 a.m. so I could head home. But there was one night, one terrifying night, that changed everything. It was a Saturday, late October, and the night was colder than usual. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your skin prickle. I was bundled up in my uniform, my golf cart rumbling quietly as I made my rounds. The streets were deserted, the houses dark, their wealthy owners either fast asleep or out of town for the weekend. The thick woods surrounding the community added an eerie sense of isolation to the place, especially at night. As I was passing by one of the unsold properties, a large house at the edge of the woods, I noticed something odd. The house was empty. No one had lived there in months, but I saw a light flicker on in one of the upstairs windows. At first, I thought it might have been a reflection or maybe some old wiring acting up, but something told me to check it out. I parked the cart and approached the house. The door was locked, as expected, but I had a master key to all the properties. I let myself in, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The place was huge, with marble floors, high ceilings, and that strange smell houses get when no one's lived in them for a while. I made my way up the grand staircase, following the faint glow coming from one of the rooms at the far end of the hall. When I reached the room, the light was gone. The window stood open, letting in a biting gust of wind that rattled the curtains. I shivered and quickly closed it, scanning the room for anything unusual. Nothing seemed out of place, just a standard bedroom with a few pieces of furniture left behind by the previous owner. I figured it was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me and turned to leave. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from the woods just beyond the window. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. It wasn't a normal animal sound. It was deeper, more menacing, like something far more dangerous than a stray dog or raccoon. My heart started racing, and I found myself rooted to the spot, staring out the window into the darkness. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out into the trees, but the beam barely penetrated the dense foliage. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it. Whatever it was getting closer. I backed away from the window, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a bear. I had heard rumors of them wandering into the area during the colder months, looking for food. But something about that growl didn't sit right with me. It sounded wrong, almost like it was something more than an animal. I hurried downstairs, locking the front door behind me as I made my way back to the golf cart. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get moving. The engine sputtered to life, and I sped down the street, trying to put as much distance between me and the woods as possible. As I rounded the corner, heading back toward the main gate, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, darting between the trees on the outskirts of the neighborhood. It was fast, too fast to be a person, and it moved with a strange, unnatural grace. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever it was heading in the same direction as me, toward the center of the neighborhood. Toward the houses. I grabbed my radio, my voice shaking as I called into the main office. "This is Graves, over. I think we've got a situation. There's something moving around out here. Could be a wild animal, but I'm not sure. Over." The response crackled through the speaker, calm and uninterested. "Roger that, Graves. Stay put. We'll send someone to check it out in the morning. Over." I cursed under my breath. Morning. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to wait till morning. I debated whether to stay in the cart or keep moving. Part of me wanted to hightail it out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. That's when I heard the scream. It was faint, carried on the wind from somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, but unmistakable. A high-pitched, terrified scream, the kind that made your blood run cold. Without thinking, I floored the gas pedal, the golf cart lurching forward as I raced toward the sound. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who could be out here this late, and what the hell was chasing them? The scream came again, closer this time. I veered off the main road, cutting through a narrow alley between two houses. As I reached the other side, I saw it, a figure running down the street, illuminated by the dim glow of a street lamp. A woman, barefoot and in her pajamas, sprinting as fast as she could. Behind her, something was chasing her. Something big. My heart nearly stopped. It was massive, hunched over, with long, matted fur and glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. It moved on all fours, but there was something almost human about its shape, like a twisted, nightmarish version of a man. I yelled, trying to get the woman's attention, but she didn't stop. She just kept running, her eyes wide with terror. I swerved the car toward her, slamming on the brakes just in time to avoid hitting her. "Get in," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. She didn't hesitate. She dove into the passenger seat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Go, go, go." I didn't need to be told twice. I hit the gas, the cart lurching forward as the creature let out a bone, chilling howl. It was gaining on us, its powerful limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. "What the hell is that thing?" I shouted, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I don't know," the woman sobbed. "It came out of the woods. I thought it was an animal, but then it started chasing me." I glanced in the rearview mirror, my stomach dropping as I saw the creature getting closer. It was nearly on top of us, its eyes locked on the cart like a predator stalking its prey. I swerved hard to the left, the cart skidding across the pavement as I tried to shake it. The creature snarled, its massive claws scraping against the ground as it changed direction. I could hear its heavy breathing, feel the vibrations of its footsteps as it closed in on us. Suddenly, the road ahead of us ended, blocked off by a tall iron fence that separated the neighborhood from the woods. We were trapped. "Hold on," I yelled, slamming on the brakes and turning the cart sharply to the side. The woman screamed as the cart tipped, nearly flipping over before crashing back down onto all four wheels. The creature was right behind us now, its snarls growing louder as it prepared to pounce. I grabbed the flashlight from the cart's dashboard and swung it around, shining the beam directly into the creature's face. It let out a deafening roar, its eyes glowing brighter as it recoiled from the light. For a split second, it hesitated, its massive body shrinking back into the shadows. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing the woman's arm and pulling her out of the cart. We sprinted toward the nearest house, my mind racing as I fumbled for the keys to the master lock. The creature howled again, and I knew we didn't have much time. I jammed the key into the lock, twisting it desperately as the door finally swung open. We tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind us just as the creature slammed into it with a force that shook the entire house. We stumbled back, breathing heavily as the creature scratched and snarled at the door, its claws raking against the wood. The woman was shaking, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her knees to her chest. What is that thing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what it was, where it had come from, or why it was here. All I knew was that we weren't safe. The creature howled again, its claws digging deeper into the door. I grabbed the nearest piece of furniture, a heavy oak chair, and wedged it under the doorknob, praying it would hold. "We need to call for help," I said, pulling out my phone, but there was no signal.